Now that we have the basic building blocks of our asteroid, in this video, we'll implement our player damage. In the link in the description, you'll find the link to freely download the assets and scripts or macro we created in this video. Feel free to download them and follow along, dissect the macro, or to simply use the completed effect in your game or project. To begin, we'll go to our asteroid's flow machine. Since many of the nodes will be similar to our asteroid laser hit, let's select and duplicate its nodes in groups. We'll start by changing our tag from laser to player. Since if the player ship is upgraded, they aren't destroyed, let's remove our GameObjectDestroy node that comes after our setCurrentPosition variable node. Since we want our asteroid to be destroyed, even if it's hit by the player's ship, we can keep our other nodes. However, we want to change our custom event trigger from add score to player hit. Let's now go into the playing state of our game manager. And we'll begin by creating a custom event receiver called player hit. So when our player is hit, we first need to see if their ship is upgraded or they still have the base ship. So we'll use a branch node to check our isShipUpgradedScene variable. If our ship isn't upgraded, we want the player to then be shown an end screen. In order to do this, let's create a custom event, which we'll call GameOverScreen. And we can use this custom event to trigger a game over state, which we'll create in our next lesson. And since spawning our base ship will use many of the same nodes as spawning our upgrade ship, let's select and duplicate our ship upgrade nodes. We can now go from our branch to our set variable node. However, before we set the current location variable, we want to set our isShipUpgraded to false. And at the moment, since our node group is so large, we'll break it up by creating a custom event node after setting our isShipUpgraded variable to false, and we'll call this custom event SpawnBaseShip. Let's now create a custom event receiver for our SpawnBaseShip custom event, and we'll connect that into our setCurrentShipLocation variable node. Let's remove our GameObjectInstantiate node for our upgrade sprite effect, and we can also remove our upgrade sprite effect set variable node as well. We'll reduce the time of our delay since we don't have our upgrade effect that needs to play, and we can reduce that to 0.1 or lower. Since we're not upgrading our ship, we can also remove the setActive node for our upgrade display object, as well as removing the set variable node for our isShipUpgraded variable. And after our GameObjectInstantiate node, let's use a collider setEnable node. This way, we can temporarily make the character invulnerable to avoid them being instantly hit again after the base ship respawns. For our collider input, let's use the collider component from our SceneSpaceshipObject variable. And let's remove the GameObjectDestroy node as well as the player score nodes. After we disable our collider, we'll use a wait for seconds node before enabling the player ship collider again. With that complete, let's leave our play state and let's create a flow state which we'll call Game Over. And let's then make a transition from our playing state and from our pause state to our Game Over state. And in both of our transition, we'll simply place our Game Over Screen custom event. Let's next go into our pause state and create an on button click event. For our input button, we'll use our exit button variable, and we'll then use a custom event trigger to trigger our Game Over Screen custom event. With that complete, let's now test our functionality so far. However, before we do so, we first need to select our asteroid, and we need to change its collider to isTrigger. And let's place our upgraded sprite into our scene. For the sake of testing, so it doesn't quickly move off screen, let's change our speed to 20, and let's change our asteroid speed to 12. We can see once our player is hit, we were then taken to our end game state. And we can also see once our player is upgraded and hit, they're taken back to the base ship form. However, we can see that we now have an error in our playing state. If we go inside our state, we can see that our Get Collider component is set to null. The reason for this is if we click on our ship, we can see that instead of a collider, we're using the collision from our character controller. However, if we were to disable our character controller even momentarily, we can see that we can no longer move our ship. So let's go back into our playing state. So instead of disabling our collider, let's instead change our game object's tag. Since all our trigger and collision events are set to check for our player's tag, if our ship's tag is different, it won't be affected by our enemies. To do this, let's delete our enable collider node and we'll instead use a component set tag node. For our input component, we'll use our spaceship object variable, and for our tag, we can simply leave that blank. Let's now duplicate our get variable and set tag node and place it after our wait for seconds node, and we'll also need to set our tag as player. While the ship is invulnerable, we need to give the player a visual indication that they can't be hit. To do this, we're going to use a sprite renderer set color node. We'll get our input sprite renderer from the component of our spaceship object variable. And we can keep our color white, but we want to adjust our alpha to be semi-transparent. Lastly, we'll duplicate this and place it after our set player tag node, and we'll place our colors alpha back at 255. And before we test our graph again, let's leave our playing state and set up the basic functionality for our game over state. Since we haven't created our game over canvas UI yet, we'll simply start by destroying our player and all of our enemies on screen. For our player, we can simply use a game object destroy node and use our spaceship scene variable as its value. And since the asteroid or enemies on screen aren't stored in a variable or array, we'll need to use a find game objects with tag node. And the tag we wanted to find is enemy. And let's create a graph node which we're going to call enemies. And we'll use a set variable node to set our enemies variable with the output of our find game objects with tag node. We want to then go for a for each loop node. And for our input list, we're going to use the output of our set variable node. In our body, we're going to use a destroy game object node and use our for each loop item output value as our destroy game object's input. And lastly, let's deactivate our AG game object. And let's also deactivate our pause menu in the event the player hit the exit button within our pause menu. With that complete, let's test our graph so far. And in order to make sure that our game over state is working correctly, let's duplicate several of our asteroids. We can see once our player hit our asteroid that our player and all the asteroids were destroyed from our scene. Additionally, we can see that it deactivated our AG game and set the value of our enemy's variable with all the asteroids in our scene before destroying them. Before we test our other functionality, within our game over state, let's create another game object set active node to deactivate our game HUD. We can see that even though our ship returned to its base form, we are still able to be hit by our enemy. If we look into our game manager graph, we can see that our player graph is highlighted. However, in our graph, we can see our errors occurring because our component set tag isn't finding a value for our scene variable spaceship object. This is most likely due to the fact that our spaceship variable doesn't have enough time to be set before attempting to set a new tag. With that said, let's copy all of our nodes after our game object instantiate node, and let's paste them in the macro of our ship itself. This way we can quickly make our character invulnerable at any point during the game, such as after upgrading and when they originally spawned into the game. And we'll place this in our ship macro after we've set our laser spawn point variable. And instead of leaving our tag blank, we need to be sure to use one of the tags that is set or we've created in the tag list. So we're going to use untagged. So we can now see when we spawn into our game that our ship is semi-transparent and our enemy asteroids can't hurt us. If we click on our spaceship game object, we can see that our tag is now set to untagged. And at the end of our invulnerable time limit, our spaceship tag is set back to player, and our sprite is fully visible, and the asteroids and enemies can now destroy our player. And we can also see that once our ship is upgraded, our player is temporarily invulnerable. This way, they won't be instantly hit the moment the player upgrades the ship. With our player hit functionality complete, in our next lesson, we'll implement our game over screen and reset functionality.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be the first to see this and many other tutorials, game development tips, and free game asset giveaways.